So this is neurotransmitters, particularly the dopamine hypothesis. So remember how neurotransmitters and the synapse works. So action potential or a nerve impulse comes down the axon to the axon terminal. Here it meets up with these vesicles which are filled with neurotransmitter. They get pushed to the outside of the cell and the neurotransmitter drifts across the synaptic gap. It meets the receptors on the other side and once enough receptors have been activated, it will send a signal. Remember, these are kind of lock and key mechanisms. So certain receptors serve as certain neurotransmitters and they can't fit into other ones. Once it's been used, it is made inactive by enzymes and then it gets reabsorbed into the presynaptic bulb for reuptake and for use again. So we have to understand that so we can understand how exactly the neurotransmitter theory works for schizophrenia. So remember, in the 1950s, we discovered a new type of medication called phenothiazines. What they do is they block a particular dopamine receptor in the brain, the D2 receptor. And what we found was that people with schizophrenia who had this receptor blocked had a reduction in their symptoms. This led us to believe that high levels of dopamine were the cause of schizophrenia, particularly that D2 receptor. So Randall and Monkford support this by looking at the effects of amphetamines on rats' brains. And we saw that when we injected them with an amphetamine, which remember is a DA agonist, it raises dopamine levels. We saw that they cause kind of psychotic type behaviors or symptoms. Remember, we can use amphetamines like cocaine, LSD and stuff as examples to prove that this theory is correct, or rather to support it. Van Rossum found it particularly linked to the D2 receptor. So again, that's the one that we particularly focus on. So remember, dopamine is just generally a neurotransmitter. It does lots of things in the brain, one of which is this kind of link that it has to attention, to schizophrenia and things like that as well. So remember, there's different types of D receptors. D1 is responsible for pleasure. D2 is activated by drug use, as well as being linked to schizophrenia. D4 is linked to ADHD. They're linked to Parkinson's disease, things like that. So dopamine is just kind of this catch-all neurotransmitter for all intents and purposes. It carries signals around the brain. And we'll get into kind of particular areas of importance later on. So dopamine activity is responsible for exploration, outgoing, pleasure-seeking behaviors, and high levels of it have also been associated with paranoia and hallucinations. So two of the classic symptoms of schizophrenia. So overactivity of dopamine in this synaptic area is associated with hallucinations and paranoia. It also kind of interacts with the locomotor system for movement. And this will explain why we see some movement-related symptoms or characteristics with schizophrenia. If you have an unusual levels of dopamine in your brain, it causes tremors, rigidity of the muscles. People who have low dopamine, remember, get Parkinson's disorder. So there's a couple of different reasons why this might be, or the idea that dopamine causes schizophrenia. It might be that A, there's too much dopamine, so literally they have high levels of the chemical. 2, it could be that they are sensitive to dopamine, and so even a tiny amount of dopamine will kind of set off a much bigger reaction. Or 3, they've got more dopamine receptors. So again, the same thing. They have kind of normalish levels of dopamine, but they've got too many receptors, so the signal gets sent too much or too easily. It could be a mix of all 3 of these things. And we've got a couple of pieces of evidence from Falkai, Seaman and Owen, which kind of adds to this or talk about this. So remember, increased dopamine sensitivity in the mesolimbic system, going kind of up through the brain, this kind of blue area in particular, causes positive symptoms of schizophrenia, whereas increased dopamine sensitivity in the mesocortical area causes negative symptoms. So remember, before we move on to glutamate, we've got lots of evidence of this, and we've done it in class already. We can talk about amphetamines. We can talk about the fact that drug medication, that which lowers dopamine, is a cure or treatment for schizophrenia. But it doesn't work on everyone, and it only works on the positive symptoms. The same sort of thing, that amphetamines only cause the positive symptoms of schizophrenia. So it might not be that it's the whole picture. And we've got various pieces of evidence and evaluation, obviously we did in class, that you can have a look at in your notes about that. Glutamate is another neurotransmitter that might be linked. It's related to schizophrenia. A big thing about the kind of glutamate hypothesis is we used to think of them as separate arguments. Remember, you could either have hyperdopamine and be very high in dopamine, or you could have hypoglutamate and be low in glutamate. And we thought these two things were two kind of different explanations of schizophrenia. But when we look at them, they kind of complement each other and they work together. So remember, glutamate is like the brake for dopamine. If you've got high levels of glutamate, you've got low levels of dopamine. If you get rid of that glutamate, and it kind of drops and you get low levels of glutamate, the dopamine level starts to increase. So these two systems can work together to explain schizophrenia. Carlson, who's your core study that we looked at whether just dopamine causes schizophrenia, and found that it's more kind of complicated than that. So when we give somebody an NMDA antagonist, so remember that is a chemical that will block the NMDA receptor, which causes lower glutamate, the dopamine starts to rise. So remember, just those two words, an antagonist blocks a receptor and deactivates it, essentially lowering the level of chemical, whereas an agonist activates the synapse and essentially raises that level of chemical by making the synapse more active. So NMDA antagonists are psychostimulants which lead to psychosis. So remember, what that does is lowers the glutamate and it gives you kind of symptoms of psychosis. However, they might inhibit the release of dopamine, lowering dopamine levels. So this means that the idea that it's high dopamine causing schizophrenia isn't the whole picture. It's more complicated than that. It might be glutamate that's the real culprit. Or again, as Carlson said, and we'll do the video shortly, as Carlson said, it might be that there is more than one explanation of schizophrenia. This could explain why there are different types, different sets of symptoms and things like that. Two parts of the brain linked to this, particularly low glutamate levels in the cerebral cortex causes negative symptoms. Problems with glutamate receptors in the basal ganglia might cause the positive symptoms. The thalamus is an area, remember, that's linked to attention. It's used for filtering information and avoiding sensory overload. And we found that if glutamate and dopamine levels are altered there, it might cause kind of confusion and psychosis again. PCP is another example of an NMDA antagonist, which lowers the glutamate levels. But it seems that if we were to give you a glutamate agonist after we've done this, it stops the kind of schizophrenic symptoms. So I'll quickly explain that. So remember, PCP is an NMDA antagonist. It lowers the glutamate levels, which therefore causes dopamine levels to rise. And you get those kind of schizophrenic psychosis-like symptoms. But if we then give you a glutamate agonist, if we give you another piece of medication or another drug that would raise your glutamate levels, your schizophrenic symptoms or your psychotic symptoms stop, despite the fact that you still have high levels of dopamine for a while. So what it might be is that glutamate, again, is the main culprit or the main cause. So that's a brief summary of it, which we'll look at again when we do a revision.